Good afternoon. My name is David Anderson. I'm honored to serve as the president of my alma mater and honored to welcome all of you, those of you here in Thompson Hall and all of you joining us via the stream, to this program sponsored by the Institute for Freedom and Community and the Martin E. Marty Chair in Religion in the Academy. We live in a divided nation, and these are contentious times. Our civil fabric is frayed and fraying. Our institutions are struggling to respond to disruptive forces, and American citizens are unsettled. Colleges and universities have too often become the sites of behavior that is inimical to their purposes. Speakers are disinvited by those who disagree with them, and when they do approach an audience, they're sometimes shouted down by partisans. We've even seen violence aimed at members of campus communities by other members of those communities. And we think about Berkeley today, where there's threats of impending violence due to the visit of a speaker. Into this problematic milieu steps the Institute for Freedom and Community. It was established at this college in 2014 to encourage free inquiry and meaningful debate about important political and social issues. By exploring diverse issues, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy answers, and foster constructive dialogue among those with different values and contending points of view. It offers a distinctive opportunity to cultivate civil discourse in the context of a liberal arts setting. One of the goals of the Institute is to promote civil discourse in a democracy. It underscores the value of having open and spirited exchanges on highly controversial subjects in a respectful and productive manner. Given the goals of the Institute and the current environment I just described, what better topic for this spring's symposium than religion and political disagreement? So over the course of a two-day period, and with the help of 4 distinguished scholars, we've been having conversations and will be having conversations about diversity within the Christian community, broadly conceived, about differences among evangelical Christians, about debates arising out of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and about disagreement among other major world religions and secular perspectives in our pluralistic and globalized society. They're provocative topics. I'm hoping for 3 things to happen. 1, that we model how to engage in meaningful debate through civil discourse. 2, that we all gain new knowledge. And 3, that we come to new understandings. Our symposium is co-sponsored with the Institute and the Department of Religion by the Martin Marty Chair in Religion in the Academy. This is a chair established to honor one of America's most distinguished historians of religion and most thoughtful commentators on religion and public life in America. Martin Marty was a St. Olaf parent, a former member of the college's Board of Regents, and at one point the college's interim president. To introduce this afternoon's speaker, I invite to the podium Professor Edmund Santuri. He is the Martin E. Marty Chair of Religion and the Academy, and he directs this institute. Professor Santuri.
Thank you, President Anderson. Welcome again to those who were with us yesterday for Professor Wolf's and Professor Black's superb lectures, and welcome to those of you who are joining our symposium now for the first time. This afternoon we hear the 3rd lecture of our 2-day symposium on religion and political disagreement, and our speaker is Mitri Raheb. Dr. Mitri Raheb is the founder and president of Dar al-Kilima University College of Arts and Culture in Bethlehem, and the senior pastor of the Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem. The most widely published Palestinian theologian to date, he's the author of 16 books. His latest book is Faith in the Face of Empire, the Bible Through Palestinian Eyes. A social entrepreneur, he has founded several church-related organizations, in addition to stimulating a number of other civic initiatives on national, regional, and international levels. This multilingual, contextual theologian received in 2015 the Olaf Prize. In 2012, the German Media Prize that is mainly granted to heads of states. And you might be interested in knowing that next month, the next former head of state who will receive this prize is former President Barack Obama. In 2013, the prestigious Wittenberg Award from the Luther Center in DC. In 2006, the International Mohammed Nafi Shalabi Peace Award of the Central Islam Archive in Germany. And in 2007, the well-known German Peace Award of Aachen. His work has received considerable attention from major international media outlets, including CNN, ABC, CBS, 60 Minutes, the BBC, The Economist, Newsweek, Al Jazeera, Vanity Fair, and others. Dr. Raheb has special connections with St. Olaf College. Over the years, he has met with a number of St. Olaf groups, students, and alums, traveling to and studying in Bethlehem. His talks to these groups have been very well received, and his unfailing hospitality is gratefully and widely celebrated. In addition, the Religion Department of St. Olaf is proud to say that Dr. Raheb's daughter, Tala, graduated with distinction in religion last spring from St. Olaf. Finally, when I mentioned last summer that the Institute had invited Dr. Raheb to speak and that he had accepted, a retired St. Olaf faculty member who has been deeply involved in work for Palestinian rights responded, and I quote, "Mitri Raheb is a courageous and eloquent advocate for his people," end of quote. The title of Dr. Raheb's lecture tonight is Religious Diversity, Political Conflict, and the Spirituality of Liberation, the Voice of a Palestinian Christian. Will you please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Mitri Raheb.
Thank you, Professor Santuri, for this introduction, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to be again here. It was exactly almost 1 year ago when I was here for the graduation of my daughter, Tala, so it's good to be back here. You know, there is no other region actually in the world where religion and politics interact, collide, and conjoin like in the Middle East. The region I come from, called the Middle East, by the way, I don't like this Middle East because it's middle of where and east of what, you know? So it's only if you live in Europe and you look at our region, you will call it Middle East. So, I mean, there you already can see some colonial perspective in the naming. However, that region is the cradle of the three monastic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But also, it is actually a region with diverse ethnicities, religious minorities, and multiple identities. And it is a region that was very much marked by over a century of colonial history, conflicting imperial interests, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In this lecture, I will try to analyze actually three cases that I would like to focus on. Contemporary case studies that all will show the use and misuse of religion in context of political conflict. The first case study I will look at is the latest debate at the United Nations Security Council regarding the Israeli settlement in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It's only like, that was in December last year. In the second case study, I will look at the interaction between religion and state in the Arab world in relation to power. And in the third, I will look at the role of Christian Zionists in the current political context. So, just to be balanced, the first case will focus on Jewish-Israeli case, the second will focus on an Arab-Islamic case, and the third on an intra-Christian Western case. After analyzing these three case studies, I will try to draw three conclusions from a liberation theology point of view. So let me come to the first, which is religion in the context of occupation, the first case study. Just to give you a short background so that those who are not familiar maybe with our conflict can follow me. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the longest ongoing conflict in modern history. This conflict actually has its root not in Palestine, but in Europe. It was exactly actually 100 years ago, 1917, that Lord Balfour promised Palestine to European Jews. I always like to underline, it wasn't the Lord God who promised Israel the land. It was the Lord Balfour. And believe me, there is a big difference between both, you know. So, and why this promise, 1917? It wasn't out of religious conviction so much, but actually it was more part of imperial politics of Great Britain. So European Jews were supposed to go to Palestine, colonize the land, helping the empire to expand there. But also it had another reason, because, the whole issue of the assimilation of Jews in Europe somehow was not going the way many people wanted in Europe, and so this was a way actually to solve this issue by sending European Jews to Palestine. So it's a political project actually. But that political project had also some religious connotations, because for many Christians in Great Britain at that time, they were actually waiting for the second coming of Christ, and they thought that establishing the state of Israel is a precondition for Jesus to come back. I would have loved to have heard yesterday from Professor Ami something about that, because I mean that's part of evangelical theology. And that Balfour Declaration, actually, that promise was made when the British troops were just outside Gaza, coming from Egypt, and they were ready to storm Palestine, and exactly at that moment, this promise was made to Lord Shield. So the colonization of Palestine was one outcome of the First World War. Fast forward, the establishment of the State of Israel was actually something that came after the Second World War. And it was exactly 70 years ago that the United Nations adopted the resolution to divide Palestine into two states, one Jewish state and one Arab state. And the Jewish state chose actually a biblical name, Israel, for itself. And the branding of the Israeli state as biblical Israel accelerated after 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. I live in Bethlehem, so this is when Bethlehem was occupied by Israel. I was at that time 5 years old. The name chosen for that war, 1967, Six-Day War, has also a biblical connotation. Like God, who finished creating the creation in 6 days, Israel was able to finish its job by occupying the rest of Palestine before they can rest. However, 1967 didn't bring rest neither to the Israeli nor to the Palestinian. On the contrary, And the longer the conflict remained unsolved with human intervention, the more it started getting religious connotation. So for a long time, it was a political conflict. But when political conflict cannot be solved politically, more and more people resort to religion. And so the outcome of the 1967 war gave a boost to Jewish religious nationalism and to Messianic extremist Jewish group within Israel who started settling, building settlements, and settlements are big cities actually in the West Bank, claiming it as Judea and Samaria. So we see, religious fundamentalism expanding after 67. We see political Islam, the same thing after 67, after the Iran Revolution. And Christian Zionism also experienced a revival after 1967. And it's interesting, 1993, when Arafat and Rabin met at the lane of the White House here in the US and were ready for a political compromise, political solution, the opposition on both sides utilized religion to empty the peace agreement. So Rabin was killed by a religious Jewish Israeli person, and Hamas started a series of suicide attacks on Israeli targets. Expanding Israeli settlement in Palestine became a tactic of Israeli government since then, who have been subsidizing the building of settlements through soft loans, tax exemptions, and modern infrastructure. So this is just the background for the first case study I want to make. So the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, maybe you hear about it here in the news. This is what I will focus on. So on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas last year, the UN Security Council met to discuss the expansion of Israeli settlement in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. A resolution, 2334, was adopted by 14 countries in favor and a US abstention. The resolution reaffirmed the Security Council's stand that Israeli settlements have no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation of the international law. The full text read as follows. I will just read a portion of it. The Security Council the Security Council, reaffirming its relevant resolutions, guided by the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and reaffirming inter alia the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force, reaffirming the obligation of Israel, the occupying power, to abide scrupulously by its legal obligation and responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war of August 1249, and recalling the advisory opinion rendered on July 9, 2004 by the International Court of Justice, condemning all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, charter, and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, including inter alia the construction and expansion of settlement, transfer of Israeli settlers, confiscation of land, demolition of homes, and displacement of Palestinian civilians in violation of international humanitarian law and relevant resolutions. Expressing grave concern that continuing Israeli settlement activity are dangerously imperiling the viability of the two-state solution based on the 67 lines. So, this debate was going on at the UN, and I was watching it from Bethlehem. It was live. And it was really interesting because all, the Security Council have 15 members, the 5 superpowers, and 10 other countries that keep revolving. And so all 14 council members were talking and made their speeches based on Fourth Geneva Convention on international law and how important it is to abide by them. The US representative explains the decision to abstain rather than to veto. Usually, the US vetoes every resolution that has to do with Palestine. This time they abstained. And why? They said because they think that settlements are undermining Israel's security and eroding the prospect for a two-state solution, thus peace and stability. Once all 15 Security Council members were given the floor, it was time now for Danny Danon, the Israeli representative to the UN, to address the Council, and this is what he had to say, and this is our case study. He's saying, this Council wasted valuable time and effort condemning the democratic state of Israel for building homes in the historic homeland for the Jewish people. We have presented the truth time and again for this Council and implored you not to believe the lies presented in this resolution. I ask each and every member of this Council who voted for this resolution, who gave you the right to issue such a decree denying our eternal rights in Jerusalem. We overcame those decrees during the time of the Maccabees, and we will overcome this evil decree today. We have full confidence in the justice of our cause and in the righteousness of our path. And then, I hope it will work.
We overcame those decrees during the time of the Maccabees, and we will overcome this evil decree today. We have full confidence in the justice of our cause and in the righteousness of our path. We will continue to be a democratic state based on the rule of law and full civil and human rights for all our citizens, and we will continue to be a Jewish state, proudly reclaiming the land of our forefathers, where the Maccabees fought their oppressors and King David ruled from Jerusalem. This holy book, the Bible, contains 3,000 years of history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. No one can change this history.
I mean, I was struck the moment he rose the Hebrew Bible at the UN, Security Council. He did that. For a Christian fundamentalist, he would say, wow, the Bible was raised at the Security Council. But actually what we see here is actually a politician raising a Hebrew Bible to undermine international law and the Fourth Geneva Convention. And if we look at the words that Mr. Danon used, he's so convinced of his own truth. We have presented the truth time again. He is convinced of the justice of his cause and the righteousness of his path. He uses words like historic homeland and eternal rights. He kept shifting between biblical Israel and the state of Israel of today as if they were one and the same. Proud, live, and reclaiming the land of our forefathers where the Maccabees fought their oppressors and King David ruled from Jerusalem. And then this holy book, the Bible, contained 3,000 years of history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a political conflict over land and rights. The UN resolution clearly refers to international laws applicable in context of occupation. Mr. Danon doesn't address this issue. He avoided it on purpose because there is no human excuse to it, and there is no way that one can excuse the colonial expansionist politics. The last resort to defend the Israeli settlement policy is God. Mr. Danon is basically saying this: we don't adhere to international law, we do not abide by the Geneva Convention, we don't care about the Bill of Human Rights because we possess divine and eternal rights. Religion is here used to avoid a political solution and to religiously legalize what is politically an aggression. watching this debate, I asked myself, how come that we arrived at a situation today where divine rights trump human rights? Is it possible to violate the human rights in the name of divine rights? Is it possible to use the biblical text to whitewash military occupation and the oppression of a whole nation? Can religious convictions lead to a severe violation of international law? The matter here is not about religious convictions, but rather how religious convictions are instrumentalized for political ends, and how divine rights are utilized to allow for the violation of human rights and to avoid solving a political conflict. And while Jewish Israelis are given land to occupy in the West Bank and in the Bethlehem region, we are stripped of any possibilities for expansion or natural growth. So this is the first, actually, case study I wanted to look at. And we will think about it a bit further later. Let me come to the second. The second case I would like to focus on, case study, is taken from the Arab-Islamic context. You know, following the 1967 war, the defeat of the pan-Arab ideology of Nasser and the loss of Palestinian land, the situation in the Middle East changed drastically. The war in 1967 was like an earthquake. It changed everything. And actually, all of the rulers you saw in the Middle East until recently, they all came to power following 1967. So, in Iraq, Saddam Hussein came to power in 1968, 1 year later. 1969, military coups saw Gaddafi take power in Libya, Assad 1970 in Syria, and then Sadat also in 1970. In all of these Arab countries around Palestine, there was only one political party, that of the president, and no other parties were allowed. Political diversity was not tolerated at all. Elections took place with only one candidate. It would be good for the states maybe next time to have only one, because you had difficulty to choose between the last two. So while political parties were forbidden, religious groups were not or could not be outlawed. The rulers used religious groups over and against each other. So Saddam sided with the Sunnis, Assad with the Alawites, Sadat with the Muslim Brotherhood. So the only other place where people could gather without becoming suspicious under these rulers was in the mosque. The mosque thus became the alternative place for the political castle. You know, I still remember as a child we were always joking, saying in these countries no one can open his or her mouth except with a dentist. Because that's unfortunately the case. So where political disagreement was not possible, religious space became the outlet for a kind of a subtle opposition. A critique of the leader was not possible, but criticizing the government was tolerated. The mosque and the political leaders were able to exist side by side for a long time. However, when the legitimacy of the political leader was in question, he would then resort to utilize religious legitimacy to stay in power. The weaker the political leader became, the more daring religious groups were in their attempt to seize power. A good case here is Iraq. Iraq under Saddam Hussein was actually ruled by one and the only party, that of Ba'ath. The Arab socialist Ba'ath ideology was actually a secular ideology, not religious at all, developed, interestingly enough, by an Arab Christian with the name of Michel Aflaq. Although Saddam ruled based on the Sunni community in Iraq, all religious groups there were more or less free to perform their religious duties. In 1991, Saddam invaded Kuwait, a neighboring Arab and Islamic country, which isolated him in the whole Gulf region. As long as he was fighting Iran, he had legitimacy in the neighboring Arab countries. The moment he invaded Kuwait, he lost that legitimacy and needed one badly. This is when he resorted to religion. Actually, from a secular party, suddenly he became so religious and added the Takbir slogan, Allahu Akbar, to the flag, which you can see actually behind him. It was clear that Saddam was losing many of his allies and wanted to gain legitimacy and support by adding an important Muslim slogan to the flag. Again, we see how religion is utilized for political purposes. In a post-Saddam era, ISIS adopted the Islamic Shahada, La ilaha illallah, on their one-color black flag as a means to get Islamic legitimacy and support. So religion, in this case Islam, was utilized as a tool by Arab political leaders to remain in power, while the same religion was utilized by religious movement to seize power. So the leader wanted to stay in power, so used religion to stay in power. The opposition used religion to overthrow him, basically. The current unhealthy relationship between religion and state in the Middle East has to do with the way the ruling regime on the one hand, as well as the opposition movements on the other, manipulate religion as a tool to exert control and unilateral authority, or conversely, to overthrow them. This means that religion is being exploited for political ends of control and access to power. And it's interesting that if we look at the Arab world, there is always a correlation between the terror of the state and the terror of religious groups. The more aggressive the state regime acts against religious groups, the more extreme they become. In the clash between the state and the religious terror groups, marginalized groups pay a high toll and diversity is weakened. Often, religious and ethnic minorities are not a target per se in the Middle East, but Christian, Yazidis, and other groups become a kind of a collateral damage in the power battle between the state and the opposing religious movements. And so diversity is weakened by this power struggle between the ruler and the opposition using religion. I hope I was able to make my second point clear. I will come to the third and last point. Christian Zionism is the third case study I would like to look at. During an international conference, which I attended in South Africa in 2015, commemorating the 30th anniversary of Cairo, South Africa, a delegation from Palestine was present, and one of the members of the delegation was Reverend Dr. Robert Smith. At that time, he was serving as the program director of the Middle East and North Africa at the ALCA and moderator of the Palestine-Israel Forum at the World Council of Churches. Dr. Smith is the author of a book called More Desired Than Our Own Salvation, The Roots of Christian Zionism, which is his doctoral thesis at Baylor. During the conference, Smith and two other Palestinians were invited to speak at an evening panel organized by one of the South African Palestinian Solidarity Group. In his short input, and after describing himself as a citizen of the United States and as a citizen of the displaced Chickasaw Nation and a current resident in Jerusalem, Robert wanted to talk about the responsibility of international Christians to the Christians of Palestine, and raised the question about why the Christian community in the world react to the suffering of the Palestinian community the way they do, and why do they allow Israel to behave the way it does. And he mentioned three reasons. First, he says that, he's saying that most of the Christians in the world, they don't know that Palestinian Christians exist, to start with. Secondly, he's saying Christians in the United States often have negative conceptions of Islam and Muslims. They operate out of fundamental fear of Islam and Muslims, along with the false understanding that the conflict is at its foundation religiously formed. That is a conflict between Islam and Judaism. Then he says, this is far from the truth. It is a conflict over land. It's a political conflict over resources. It is a political conflict over self-determination and decolonizing principles. And then he continued saying
First,
this.
I would say that the Christians in the United States, and I assume also in South Africa, often do not know that Christians are present in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and within the state of Israel. They have a false imagination of what Israel is and what Palestine is. They falsely assume that Israel is made up solely of Jews and that the West Bank is made up solely of Palestinian Muslims. But this is not true. And even if it were true, it does not excuse the actions of the state of Israel. Secondly, Christians in the United States and in many other places have negative conceptions of Islam and Muslims. They operate out of a fundamental fear of Islam and Muslims, along with a false understanding that the conflict is at its foundation religiously formed, that it is a conflict between Islam and Judaism. This is so far from the truth. It is a conflict over land. It is a political conflict over resources. It is a political conflict over self-determination and decolonizing principles. It is not, first and foremost, about religion, although the continuation of the political conflict brings us closer to very dangerous religious conflict. And finally, Christians in the United States and in many other places, and I've heard many South African friends this week tell me, are influenced by the imperial theology known as Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is, first and foremost, political activity. It is not really a theology. It is not a commitment to doctrines and principles of faith. It is a political ideology that supports Jewish control over the land that now contains Israel and Palestine. Empire seeks to divide us from one another. Empire seeks to divide Palestinians from one another, dividing family against family, neighbor against neighbor. But our shared struggle and our shared resistance unites us and disrupts the desires of empire, tells empire that we will not be divided, that we seek freedom for all. It is essential that all of us understand that the Israel of the Bible, the ancient Israelites, are not linked in any substantive or material way to the contemporary modern state of Israel. The biblical narrative of Israel has almost nothing to do with contemporary Israel other than the intentional manipulation of sacred text to justify a political project. We must reject the theological justification for the present acts of the state of Israel, and we must instead draw from our sacred texts, the Quran, the Torah, the Tanakh as a whole, and the Christian scriptures, to instead inform resistance to empire that is faithful to our traditions.
So this was part of his presentation, and you can agree or disagree with what Robert is saying, but 3 weeks ago, Robert Smith became a target for a social media smear campaign orchestrated by an American Christian who described himself as a media analyst. The smear campaign uses a quote from Robert Smith presentation in South Africa that reads, "The biblical narrative of Israel has almost nothing to do with contemporary Israel other than the intentional manipulation of sacred text to justify a political project." In any debate about any Christian doctrine, theologians can speak their mind, critique almost everything. I mean, one can question the existence or non-existence of God. Many theologians do that. The divinity of Christ, the historicity of any biblical story, but dare anyone question anything regarding the state of Israel? Because there are watchdogs. It seems that when it comes to the issue of Israel, neither religious disagreement are allowed, nor diverse political opinions are tolerated. Even worse, every credible theologian or researcher who dare to question the religious aura of the state of Israel become a plausible target for all kinds of Israeli watchdog groups. And the Israel lobby is very clever because they don't do the attack themselves. They send these Christian Zionists to do the attacks, like we see here. If one follows the smear campaign done over 2 days, one would notice the following. The campaign is intended to scare Robert so that he starts censoring himself. By mentioning Notre Dame University, this is now the current employer of Robert Smith, in the campaign, the university is dragged into the issue and will either exert pressure on Robert or even fire him. I know some of you experience that in your colleges. It's not something that it's done only here. One religious or political view on Palestine can therefore cost people their job, reputation, and come close to a character assassination. And I know what I'm talking about because, I receive lots of these death threats all the time. But last but not least, there is no room for dialogue or diverse opinion or academic or political disagreement at all. The message is not debated here, but rather the messenger is targeted. And this is the tactic of many Christian Zionist groups against Christian again. This tactic comes close to radical Islamic group that cannot tolerate modern Muslim critical thinking by declaring them as kafir, that is apostate, and thus deserving the death penalty. Killing as well as character assassination in the name of God becomes a religious duty. It's something, that really has to make us think about what's happening here. So these are quickly the 3 case studies, and let me come with 3 short conclusions out of liberation theology concepts. The first point I would like to make is on divine and human rights, divine rights and human rights. In context of conflict, as in the Middle East, groups often utilize divine rights to deny other equal human rights. We find these groups within all 3 monotheistic religions. These are not only Islamist groups in Iraq and Syria, but also Jewish groups in Israel, as well as Christian Zionists. 2 forces are currently violating the human rights in our region. So-called security states, who don't allow people to move, to have an opinion, to publish controversial books, or question policies, or simply to think critically, and religious movements who leave no room for people to choose their beliefs and to breathe freely. Both forces, the state and the religion, create systems based on fear. The fear of the state and the fear of God become 2 sides of the same coin. A society that is based on fear rather on freedom kills the soul and the spirit of its people, their innovation and their creativity. There will be no future for the Middle East until we break out from the bondage of the security state as well as of oppressive religious laws to a wide open space where human life and security is protected, human security is protected, where freedom is free to blossom, and where human rights become sacred. For us as Christians, a spirituality of liberation is a spirituality of creation and incarnation. Spirituality of creation means all people are created equally in God's image. In fact, all three monotheistic religions could agree on this, theoretically. As Christians, we believe also that in Christ and in Bethlehem, God became human so that all human lives is sanctified. Such a theology of liberation is essential in our region today. But in today's world, we adhere also to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that clearly states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. I mean, we cannot go back to a time before the Universal Declaration. It should not be acceptable by religious or political terms to violate human rights in the name of divine rights, or to play God against the humans. Groups who do that are misusing the scriptures for their own political ideology. The scriptures and the Human Rights Charter are there for one and the same reason: to defend the meek, protect the rights of the weak, put limits to those in power, and to make sure that the state adheres to the laws. So both religion and state have to ensure that the power of law and not the law of power prevails. No religion or human legislation is entitled to give the Israeli more rights than Palestinians, Muslims more privileges than Christians, or men higher wages than women, although I know this is done. Equality is something we cannot compromise on, neither religiously nor secularly. So that's my first point. My second point had to do with the cross, and this is part of my newest book that just came out this week, so I make some advertisement. The Cross in Context, Suffering and Redemption in Palestine came out just this week. The cross as the ultimate critique of state and religious terror. For too long, I think we have tried to spiritualize the notion of liberation in the Bible. We replaced liberation with salvation, and the cross became nothing but atonement. I think we have to put the cross in its original context of political and religious violence. Jesus was one of the many who experienced on his own body the violence of both state as well as religious terror. The cross is a permanent reminder of the millions of people who are persecuted either by the state or by the religious establishment because they raise their prophetic critique to an unjust ruler or to a corrupt form of religion. The cross is a reminder of all those innocent killed in the name of God. There is an urgent need today to discover this dimension of the cross. The fact that Jesus died on the cross by a combination of state and religious terror is of utmost importance as a critique to both powers. The cross thus becomes the ultimate critique of state as well as religious violence. The cross becomes a mirror that shows God's vulnerability and the cruelty of political and religious behavior. For the peoples of the Middle East who are living either in context of Israeli occupation or in context of political despotism or affected by the daily use of religious extremism, this dimension of the cross is of utmost importance. Both religion and the state must be under the rule of law as a means of protection from political despotism on the one hand and from tyrannical and repressive religious extremism that bans what it dislikes and legitimizes what suits its ambitions on the other hand. The role of the state is to safeguard the right of all its citizens. On the other hand, religion has an important role to inspire its followers to be compassionate. Securing human dignity and well-being of the people is at the core of religion and the ultimate goal for statehood. There is a dire need for a prophetic and dynamic faith today that does not run away or hide from the challenges of the society, but instead engages the society for the good of all citizens. The alternative to state and religious terror is a society based on civil laws, freedom, compassion, equal citizenship, irrespective of one's religious convictions, cultural identity, socioeconomic status, or race. And last but not least, a vision for a world marked by diversity. The story of Pentecost in the book of Acts, chapter 2, is imperative to understanding the spirituality that is needed in the Middle East because it provides a counter-narrative to the logic of the oppressive regime. The narrative of the oppressive regime is found in Genesis 11 in the story of the Tower of Babel, where a mighty empire with a strong economy reaches to heaven and with one language holds the empire together. This is exactly what Alexander the Great and the Greeks tried to do with imposing Greek and Hellenistic culture on their conquered peoples in the Middle East. Alexander had the ambitious plan to pour all tribes and groups into one gigantic melting pot. The outcome of this forceful unification was utter confusion. The empire fell apart and dissolved. The Romans tried the same experiment with no more success. The Byzantine emperor Constantine thought that by forcing one creed at Chalcedon, he could unite his empire behind one emperor and one faith. The Oriental identities and expression of faith in Egypt and Syria and so on were declared heretic and were persecuted. The Arabs tried to push their language onto the Berbers of North Africa and on Central Asian countries, which led to the opposite effect of less identification with their empire by those tribes. This issue is central for a Middle East which is pluralistic in nature. No single empire has been able to force the region into uniformity. There was never one single Catholic church that monopolized the Christian faith in the Middle East, like in Europe, for example, but rather national churches, Copts, Syriac, Maronites, Greeks, etc., each worshipping in their own native language and possessing, as they do today, a distinct cultural identity. The same is true for Islam. It too has different expressions according to different regions, Shiites, Sunni, Alawites, Druze, etc. All efforts to forcefully unify them have come to naught. The Middle East continues to be one of the most diverse regions in the world, with multiple ethnicities, religious affiliations, and plural identities. For any empire, this was and is both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because the region resisted all attempts of forceful inclusion, but an opportunity because the empire was forever keen to play one group against the other and ensure that the region remained preoccupied with internal fightings so that the empire job of control was easier. This is part and parcel of colonial history in the Middle East. In this context, the story of Pentecost shows an alternative vision of the region by reversing the story of the Tower of Babylon. Jerusalem becomes the counter-narrative of Babel. Here, various nations and cultures meet. They don't speak the language of the empire, but rather their own native language. Their identities are respected and embraced. The Spirit, the Holy Spirit, provides the software for communication so that they understand each other. It's like with the new mobiles. I think if they had mobiles with this translation capability like today, this would have been easier. But this is what the Spirit did in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. In this story, the rich diversity of the region is embraced and celebrated. It is regarded as strength rather than as deficiency. The multiple identities of the region are viewed not as contradictions, but as a treasure to save. In Jerusalem, 2,000 years ago, the people from the whole oikumene stood on equal footing. Parthians, Medans, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts, Cretans and Arabs. The moment Pentecost was taken out of its original context, it became a nice story without any particular significance. It became a tale about speaking in tongues and thus lost its contextual relevance. The church born in Jerusalem was meant to counter the empire, not by creating another empire, but by providing a new ecumenical vision. The spirituality so urgently needed today, more than at any other previous time, is one that embraces diversity and celebrates it as strength. So to sum up, a Christian spirituality of liberation is crucial contribution not only to the survival of the Christian community in that part of the world as such, but is crucial for the future of the Middle East at large, ensuring that human rights are protected, prophetic critique is raised, and diversity is celebrated. And I think this is exactly our role as Palestinian Christians in that part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitri, for that splendid presentation. We're going to inaugurate Q&A with two questions from department members, faculty members in the St. Olaf Religion Department. First, Professor James Hansen.
Thank you, Mitri, for that really engaging talk. And I know time is short, but I can't help but take this opportunity to just give witness to the hospitality that Professor Santuri talked about, that St. Olaf's students and staff have enjoyed. We've had 3 groups there since 2011, and during the interim, and I know others have too. And it's always been just a transforming experience, and we come away marveling at what you've created there, and not least a university that is dedicated to arts and culture, which of course is a beautiful thing. The thing I think one of all the many things here, I think one of the most significant, of course, is the way the Bible functions in all of this, and both how it functions, but also what parts of this, the book that he held up is 3,000 years of history, and but it's also got extremely diverse views in it, right? I mean, it's not just a univocal testimony to one point of view, and so. And I think we saw that in your presentation that you have those, for example, who want to emphasize the divine right to the land, and you were critical of the political use of that to legitimate Israeli occupation. But I guess the question is then how do you adjudicate those? How do you say, well, this part is political and illegitimate, and this part of the Bible, which of course also, the liberation is another part. How does that, which also of course makes political claims? How is that? How do you adjudicate between those two? And then, if I can add just a second part of that, is it problematic at all, given the history of the cross in Jewish-Christian relations, to put that at? I mean, I totally share your concern for putting the cross in its actual, historical and political context as an execution, but it hasn't always functioned as a critique of power. It's also functioned as a symbol of power. And so is there a way? And it strikes me, of course, that the Hebrew Bible also has this, the prophetic tradition of critique of empire, of critique of, and I'm wondering if maybe in the what you would think about developing that common ground, and meeting Israelis and Jews on that piece of shared tradition. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is really a very important question. I like always to say that the Bible, I'm not sure how many of you were in Jerusalem, but the Bible is like an Oriental bazaar. You go there and you have so many things and you can choose. And so it's always interesting to see what people choose, why, when, and for what ends. And I don't think that there is any theologian, this is my opinion, I don't believe that there are theologians who come with a bird view and have no interest whatsoever. I mean, in every exegesis, there are interests involved. And I have no problem if people tell me of their interests. My problem always with people who try to claim that they don't have any interests, but all what they say is the truth and nothing but the truth. And I think this is where we have to be critical. In fact, yesterday when Amy was giving her presentation, I was exactly thinking of that question because, I mean, evangelicals, I mean, the Bible is a huge book, I mean, I think there were some studies showing that most of the evangelical, I think, they quote 118 verses from the whole Bible. So why these 118 and no other? So there are always interests there, and sometimes conflicting interests. I think the question, one of the criteria I tried, at least today, to show here is human rights. Human rights are one criteria, one out of many criteria, but I wanted today just to focus on this one. One of many criteria to say, okay, the use of this, if you use this, the Bible, to the well-being of your neighbors, etc., this is legitimate. If you use it against your neighbor, then I would say that is not legitimate. So that is one criteria. But, you know, I think the debate has to continue. Now, regarding the second question, I understand, I think, what you are saying, why choosing the cross. But I mean, as a Lutheran theologian, the cross plays a very important role. And I tell you, I mean, in our part of the world, I mean, seeing how many people are killed in the name of God, for me, this becomes a very, very important issue. It has nothing to do so much with Israel, but I mean, the whole region, killing people in the name of God or in the name of the state, is terrible. And I think the cross wants to make us sensitive to this reality, that you know, not everyone that is executed in the name of God or in the name of the state is criminal or is kafir or whatever. There are, I mean, and so, but yeah, we have the larger prophetic tradition, and I have written about that in other books that we share with, you know, with not only with Jewish theologians, but also others, definitely. I mean, the prophetic tradition is not only in the New Testament, because the reality of the empire started 3,000 years ago with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greek, the Roman, etc. And so this is why throughout the whole Bible we have that spirituality of liberation.
Professor Raheb, let me echo my colleagues' thanks to you for being such a gracious host to us, and also witnessing to the significance of actual practice and experience, which is another significant feature of the lived religious life that goes beyond mere ideas. And yeah, nonetheless, here's an idea question. It seems like your critique of the instrumentalization of religion for political ends comes out very strongly. And that raises a question for me about your drawing on liberation theology, because it seems like liberation theology develops, certainly in Latin America and Black American liberation theological context, as not shying away from the political, the marriage between religion and politics. One strategy is to appeal to secular things that we're all supposed to have in common, no matter what our religious differences are. But that isn't the majority position, I think, of most liberation theologians. Usually what they say is, look, we've got a war of myths going on, and we've got competing religious myths, and one of those religious myths is the one that takes the side of the oppressed. And so while it's certainly true that religion can be instrumentalized, it's not true that there's some sort of neutral, secular sphere in which we're going to avoid this type of conflicts of powers. And in relation to that theoretical question, I'm curious about the example that you gave of Christian Zionists and the sort of smear campaign of Robert. Because one way of reading that is to say, well, the solution is just to let everyone have their view, let diversity flourish. And of course, you ought not to engage in smear campaigns, but Christian Zionism is just one view. It's just as good as any other view. And that becomes a type of relativism, and the forum becomes a neutral sort of space where there's no sort of pursuit of positive conceptions of freedom. You've only got a negative conception of freedom. There's no conception of positive accounts of justice. It's neutral between competing interests. Is that what you're arguing for with this spirituality? I noticed that you oftentimes talked about secular stuff in terms of justice, rights, et cetera, and then religion provides compassion. How do you find your way around that tension?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this gives me actually a reason to talk about a second criteria. And that is, I mentioned it, maybe it wasn't very clear, the power balance or the power imbalance. Because there are theologies of the empire, and there are theologies of the oppressed. And I think this is a very important criteria we have to keep in mind. I mean, every empire was trying to develop their theologies. As I said, usually it leads into confusion. But I think the power of theology with the oppressed people is something that I don't want to take away from them, just and to so that they will start expressing themselves only in secular language, because I think theology is something that they live, something that it helps them to keep going, but it helps them see that the empire is not the ultimate reality. There is something actually bigger than the empire. And so that power imbalance is a very important aspect. So if theology is used again to oppress people, this is, or let me put it differently, this is sometimes our problem as Palestinians. Because, I hear many people saying, we are neutral. But how can you be neutral in a situation of power imbalance? Because neutrality in a situation of power imbalance means you are siding with the powerful. And I think this is actually what we see in the Bible. This is why the word righteousness in the Old Testament doesn't mean, doing justice just like that. It means actually changing the power balance so that those who are crushed are actually empowered to be on equal footing. And if people are on equal footing, then you can speak about balance. But unfortunately, in most of the struggles of the world, there is no balanced conflict. It's always imbalanced.
We have some time for questions from the larger audience.
It seems people want a break before the next one.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on the story about the trade of smokeless gunpowder that was given to the Brits in exchange to kind of nail down the trade of the land. Or, do you know about that?
Not that much that I can actually speak about it, unfortunately.
I was just thinking that that might support the idea that this was kind of a giveaway deal in exchange for the Brits acquiring this secret of smokeless gunpowder.
Yeah, no, I'm not aware of it, unfortunately. I think we have there one.
Thank you for your presentation. One question that I have with your emphasis in point 2 on the cross is the critique of state and religious terror is also how does the traditional Lutheran theology of the cross fit into your perspective?
Lutheran theology is a very wide spectrum. I would consider myself to be part of Lutheran theology, so this is one understanding. But I mean, you have others, and I think we have here, some other theologians who would argue about the cross and see it differently. But I think this aspect of the cross is something that, in our context, and remember, this is the original context of the Bible. I mean, the Bible did not originate in the Bible Belt. Right? I mean, thanks God. I mean, imagine. It's really originated in Palestine, in that context of imperial Roman oppression and occupation. And I think for me, actually, that's something that a theologian that does not live under occupation maybe will never actually come to grasp what it means. But for me, in that context, and in the context of what's happening in the Arab world right now, I mean, with all of this killing in the name of God, this becomes a very, very important aspect of the cross that I hope that, at least this way of looking at the cross maybe could be helpful and widen the perspective of how we look also as Lutherans on the cross.
Thank you very much.